as a result of kind of the COVID and the economic stress of closing down an economy, basically, you kind of get these government responses, right? How are we going to maintain some viability in the economy as you have basically shut down, 120 million people have now stopped working, all these businesses have to close down, and we kind of see policy responses of kind of like press the pause button. Right? How do we maintain that? Like these businesses it's not a car. You can't just shut off the engine and then turn it back on and it's going to keep on running. But, policymakers try to kind of say, how do we prevent people from separating from firms so that when we start up again, we don't have to do this reallocation and try to get individuals to match up. The initial view of the payroll protection by its definition was that we want to keep employees with firms. So we're going to basically subsidize the firm by providing them with money to maintain the payroll for these 2 or 3 months that we were going to freeze the economy so that we didn't have to worry about these individuals going on unemployment, even though we had unemployment programs as well, subsidies through the unemployment program. And we kind of wrote up an op-ed, me and a colleague of mine, Makridis, we wrote up an op-ed thinking that, the two forces here was timeliness versus targeting would be the issue here, right? Because we wanted the money to get there fast, but they wanted it to kind of get to firms that needed it. So they basically gave a very general 500 employee cap, for example, and kind of spread the money. And what we were going to say was, given that they were utilizing the banks to distribute these fundings, we kind of said, well, the problem is we know from a lot of our research that relationships between banks and lenders would mean that certain companies would get access to the bank lending first, because if I've been borrowing money from the bank and I'm a small business, I'm more likely to get first the money than, John Smith that comes in and says, oh, I need, and I've never met this bank before, right? So we were back to before it was even passed, and we had the op-ed in Barron, and we were saying, look, these are going to be issues that are going to be affecting kind of how this money gets allocated. And then moreover, we said, how much money would we need, right? Because back then, a lot of the debate was like, how big should this program be? People throwing out trillion here, 2 trillion there, like these numbers were all over the place. Well, theoretically, how big could this be? And we did a simple exercise in terms of estimating the total amount by basically going into public data from the census and saying, look, if we take the distribution of payroll for these firms that are small businesses, right? We make some adjustments for the fact about, the cap on 100,000 salary per employee. We estimate then by each state how much money would need to be doled out. We basically came up with around 750 million would be required in order to cover all these small businesses for 3 months to cover payroll, right? Because initially that was kind of the response. Eventually, kind of this was during now the debate where they had originally funded it, the funding dried up after less than a week, right? So then they added an incremental 200 or 300 million, which ended up being close to around 750 million, our estimate in terms of the amounts. And then we kind of decided, well, let's evaluate kind of how this money was doled out. And what you ended up seeing with the timing and the bank arguments that I made, that if you look at the first allocation, that first allocation was more skewed towards areas where there was banking relationships, right? That certain firms, certain states were getting more of the money earlier on. In the second allocation, right, that reversed, right? We saw now the money going to the areas that were getting less in the first. So it was more of a timing, right? That in that sense, you were now spreading it to these other areas as well. And we could use our predicted number, which is kind of what we use to judge the implementation of the actual program, and said, this is a predicted payroll that needed to get there. And this was the actual allocation of the 2 rounds. And what you ended up seeing is that like the R squared was basically 0.99. So it was following, like if you were to plot the predicted and the actual, which we do in the paper, it's kind of a 45-degree angle. Most of the states are in there and most of the industries are being allocated, some a little bit more or less, but it's really pretty close to how payroll the distribution of payroll, right? So if you think of the regressing the actual allocation versus the predicted, the coefficient was like basically 0.98 or 0.97. So that means for every predicted dollar, the actual allocation was 97 cents, right? So that seemed to be kind of in the spirit of the design of the program. Now, in terms of for economic efficiency and allocations and the effectiveness, was this targeted to areas that needed it most? I think it's an important question. We care about it from a welfare perspective, but we also have to be a little, and we also have to be a little bit kind of realistic that back in March when this program was being developed, kind of the connotation was we were in this massive pandemic that was going to come in. There was this huge wave where numbers about death tolls were in the millions in some of these estimates, right? So, and I think now, it's easy ex post to say, well, why didn't they target it to the areas where COVID was going to be highest? And well, imagine being the politician back then that says, well, we should only give the money to New York City areas, LA areas, like the larger cities. You could really imagine that was going to go well in Congress and in the news from a lot of these other states. The money didn't seem to be going at least in the first allocation into areas where there was higher exposure to COVID, where you had more business shutdowns. From my perspective, it still was allocated based on payroll, which was kind of the design back then. So whether I think it's rightly to criticize the goal, the policy goal of like covering all payroll, but I don't think the implementation was wrong, right? I think a lot of people now say, oh, the banks didn't give the money right. The money wasn't given out right. Well, no, it was called the payroll protection. It was meant to trace payroll. And what we see is that it traced payroll. It's just that the tracing of payroll wasn't that correlated to where COVID was the highest, right? And I think in that sense, we need to kind of step back and think about for the future, what are the issues we need to deal with? And I think some of these issues were like, we didn't really have tracing, so we couldn't really target where exactly this was going to hit because we really didn't know. It's hard to kind of ex ante without any information about today say, oh yeah, we should just be allocating the money to X and Y spots. It's still important to see, the money didn't get to certain areas, what happened. And I think that should be addressed because we still need to make sure that we can come back from this in an efficient way.